I just got my latest religious studies action toy, Moses. He's a big part of this segment. Judaism's story is told in two parts. The first part, the Bible, may not be history, but it is the backdrop against which the rest of the story of the Jews happens. And the biblical story begins with Abraham. Abraham's story is set 3,700 years ago, about the same time as the Aryan migrations into the Indus River Valley. Abraham lived in Ur, in southern Mesopotamia, at least until the God Yahweh told him to leave, promising him and his descendants after him the land of Canaan. But the story of Abraham, his son Isaac, and his grandson Jacob seems like a story of unfulfilled promise. Jacob and his 12 sons were forced to abandon Canaan for Egypt in order to find food. And time passed. 300 years passed. Their descendants eventually became slaves to Pharaoh. Then Moses was chosen by God to lead 1 million Hebrews, as they were now called, out of Egypt in a miraculous delivery. And after 10 plagues, the angel of death, a pillar of fire, and a pillar of cloud, and a crossing in the Red Sea on the dry ground, the Hebrews arrived safely on the other side in the Sinai wilderness. But almost immediately, they made God so angry that he banished every one of them from the promised land. Only those who were born in the wilderness were allowed into Canaan. Even Moses died a wanderer. It was left to his successor, Joshua, to lead the people into the land. After a series of battles led by Yahweh himself, Yahweh's promise to Abraham finally seemed fulfilled. In the biblical story, the religious and the political can't be separated. Yahweh had created a people, and whether he was raising up charismatic warriors to defeat the threat of neighboring kingdoms, or choosing kings to unite the Hebrew tribes into their own single kingdom, Yahweh was deeply involved in government. Yahweh was involved even when David's kingdom split into 2 kingdoms. Yahweh chose the kings of both kingdoms, and for both, it was Yahweh's law, given to Moses on Mount Sinai, that was to serve as the law of the land. And when that law was ignored, the greed of the powerful and the oppression of the weak were blamed on idolatry. For the everyday Hebrew, religion was simply a matter of keeping the Sabbath, avoiding certain foods, circumcising their sons as a mark of the covenant with Yahweh, and celebrating festivals throughout the year. There was no weekly gathering, no formal practice. For the wealthy, though, it meant grand sacrifices in the temple and the ensuing feasts. For centuries, Yahweh chose prophets to speak his anger about the excess and demand a return to the covenant established in the wilderness. But after almost 500 years, his patience was gone. In 597 BCE, the southern kingdom of Judah suffered the same fate that the northern kingdom of Israel had suffered 125 years earlier. Yahweh brought the Babylonian Empire down upon them, and the elite were carried into exile. The temple, built by King David's son Solomon, was destroyed and the city was laid waste. For most other peoples of history, this was the end of the story. Not so for the Hebrews. During their exile, Hebrew tradition blossomed into Jewish tradition. The Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible that are now central to Judaism, was completed, and when the Persians defeated the Babylonians, they sent the Jews home to Jerusalem. And the study of Torah took its place alongside the priestly sacrifices in the temple. And this is the way the biblical story ends. The second part of the story begins as a subject people. First under the Persians, then under Greeks, and finally under the Roman Empire. The Romans allowed the Jews to practice their own religion and govern their own daily lives, but the Jews hated being subject. In 66 CE, Jewish zealots launched a disastrous uprising. The Romans laid siege to the city of Jerusalem, and 4 years later the city was destroyed. The temple was flattened. Jews were forever banished from the city of Jerusalem, instead scattered across the world, to Egypt, to Babylon, to Syria, to Rome, even to India. This was the Diaspora. The constant in the story of Judaism is that disaster has always led to a recreation of tradition. In 70 CE, the temple was gone. Sacrifice was no longer a possibility. The study of Torah that once took its place alongside the sacrifices now stood alone. With the Mishnah and the Talmud, rabbinic Judaism, defined by its constant searching for more meaning, became all of Judaism. Life inside the other cultures was occasionally good, but hostility against the Jews always reemerged, and it was often fierce. Massacres of Jews were frequent under both Christian and Muslim rule. The 1800s seemed to offer a change from all of that. For centuries, Jews had clustered apart from the wider cultures in neighborhoods called the Jewish Quarter, or ghettos. And toward the end of the 1800s, they were pressed by European governments to come out of their neighborhoods and assimilate into the wider groups. This is the time of the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment. It's a time that gave the world Marx and Freud and Einstein. But it's also a time when the relatively conservative religion was faced with modernity. For 1600 years, Judaism was simply Judaism, and now a new diversity appeared. Some Jews fully embraced modernity, abandoning much that they saw as the old ways. The language of worship, for instance, became the language of the society outside the synagogue doors. This was the Reform movement. The conservative movement responded by trying to hold on to the old as they reached out to the new. Hebrew was a key identifying feature for them. In many parts of the Jewish world, though, no attempt was made to modernize at all. By default, these are the Orthodox Jews. Many found it best to abandon the old world altogether and immigrated to America. Other European Jews wanted to immigrate too, but to a place of their own. The Zionist movement called for a Jewish homeland. Some took the initiative and moved to British-controlled Palestine, where they fought a guerrilla war against the British and the Palestinians who were already there. Then the worst disaster of Jewish history came in 1933. When Hitler rose to power in a bankrupt Germany, the Jews were his scapegoat. In all, his Nazi government killed 6 million Jews. And in 1947, the United Nations declared that Palestine should be divided among the Jews and the Palestinians. The Zionists quickly displaced 1 million Palestinian Arabs and established the State of Israel. Today, 20 million Jews live in mostly in Israel and the United States. Many are no longer particularly religious. In the U.S., those who are religious are usually conservative and Reform Jews. In Israel, the numbers of religious Jews has risen sharply over the years with the arrival of Russian, Eastern European, and Yemeni Jews, and they practice an Orthodox religion.